principal interests in the environment and the arts came together. So it's very appropriate that they are here. I also want to introduce Barbara Hale, because we sort of framed this event as a conversation. And so Barbara's going to be the facilitator and conversant. Barbara's known Vanessa for many years, and she is currently curator emerita at the Half-and-Ruffer Museum. She's been in that post since 2002, when she retired after 33 years of service, according to her LinkedIn page, to the museum and the university. And she's done a lot of work on art and culture of the Plains peoples, and the most pertinent book she wrote came out in 2001 from the Half-and-Ruffer. I think I've got the date right. Gifts of Love and Pride.
Pride and Love.
Pride and Love, okay. I knew I was going to screw that up. And that one is directly about Kiowa cradleboards and beadwork. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Barbara.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Nice to meet you all, and thank you for your interest in this wonderful collection, and for you to get it to the Northeast Document Conservation Center, which is the best place to get rid of foxing and water stains and so forth. I wanted just a note about the collector, Mrs. Sharp. I know that she went on her honeymoon to the Northern Plains, and that Charlie Russell was her pack guide for her group. And she made a lot of collections then, and many of which are in the RISD Museum. So it's possible that she could have purchased these at that time. Well, to begin with, my association with Vanessa has been a long and very dear one. Vanessa is not only an artist, but she is a very wonderful representative of the Kiowa people, and she has dedicated her life to keeping alive the traditions of the Kiowa people. And I know you've told me that when you were younger, people got after you for dressing in a traditional manner. And what made you decide to do that and to keep on doing it?
It was the influence of my grandparents. My grandmother dressed in a cloth dress and a belt every day, and braids every day of her life. And she was my conscience. She was my cheerleader. She was everything to me.
And she was the wife of Stephen Mopope.
Yes, the second wife. Yes.
The second wife of Stephen Mopope, and her name was Anna.
Yes.
That's not to say that he had two wives at one time.
No, successively. And another thing that Vanessa has taught me is that the Kiowa artistic culture is very interrelated. The music, the dance, the beadwork, the painting. And so the fact that Stephen Mopope was a dancer and also played the flute, was it unusual at the time?
No, it was part of everyday life. We didn't know any different. You know, the thing, one of the most important things that should come out of this conversation is that he got into a lot of trouble because they were supposed to become normal, everyday American citizens. And, you know, he wasn't doing that. You know, he was still dancing, he was painting. All of the artwork that you see up there, all of that was forbidden. You know, you had your food rations withheld, you had the possibility of you going to jail, you had the possibility of having your children removed from your custody and be placed either into the Indian school or possibly being adopted by non-Indian people, just because they were so bent on us being mainstreamed. And my folks were definitely not mainstream.
And so the idea of the dance particularly seemed to be a very dangerous
Yes.
thing, because it united people spiritually.
Yes.
And then memories of Wounded Knee and the ghost dance and so forth. The U.S. government was afraid
Yes.
to have people dance.
Yes.
But your grandfather
My grandfather
stood up to
was,
that.
yes.
Uh-huh.
And even with his own mother, they got his relatives together, his church relatives. And really what it boiled down to was he was supposed to be beaten into submission. And instead, his mother, you know, got him by the hand and walked him to the door and, you know, excused him. And so now, you know, she's sitting there with the rest of her relatives. And he wrote a letter to her, which I still have. He said, if you ask me to stop painting, he said, it would be as if you asked me to stop breathing. He said, that's how important. He said, I can't explain it. He said, this is just important to me. And she was very supportive of him, very encouraging. And he was punished because his children, when they died, they were actually denied a funeral. Can you imagine?
Because he was dancing.
Because he was dancing, and because he was painting. You know, this was how terrible it was, and no one seems to understand what he went through. And we have, I have letters, I have photographs, I have his sketches, you know, but you know, that is probably the most important part of the message that I'm bringing you, is that he suffered. You know, his first marriage was destroyed because of the punishment. And it was their child that died. And it was only through her father's efforts that the child was given a proper burial. But you know, it was Susie Peters who came with a driver, and she got my grandfather's 2 children and reassured him that she would take them and they would be given a funeral.
Oh.
You know, but
Susie Peters was a great help to...
Yes. She fell in love with our people. She was supposed to be teaching us how to can, how to have a permanent wave done. We were supposed to.
She was a field matron of the U.S. government to the tribe. Yeah.
And instead, we adopted her. We dressed her. And I remember the week before she passed away, I remember my grandmother very carefully dressing us, you know, braiding our hair with new ribbons. And I remember us going to her house. And I remember her, you know, she was so weak, but I remember her trying to sit up. And she's saying, turn around. She said, let me look at you. She said, oh, you're so pretty. You know, and this was how important she was to my grandfather and to my grandmother. Yes.
And she's the one that actually saw the talent in Stephen Mopope and in the 5 other young Kiowa people, 1 woman and 4 other men. They became known as the Kiowa Six as long as the woman was involved, but she didn't stay with them long because she felt...
And there were other students. Laura Pedrick was the name I was looking for.
Pedrick,
I
yes,
tell you, I think
right.
at 2 o'clock in the morning. That was the name I was looking for, Laura Pedrick.
Yes.
But she was educated at Carlisle. She became a field matron. But she also...
supported.
Well, she returned to a cloth dress and leggings. And doing everything that she wasn't supposed to be doing. You know, but this is, I mean, you have to make a stand. How much are you willing to give up? You know, I mean, are you willing? Last night, remember at dinner, I was telling you, Oklahoma, there's a song they're singing, and they're saying, they're going to arrest you. Go ahead and dance hard. And, you know, but I mean, it's encouraging them to,
Dance harder.
Dance harder.
Because of the danger, yes.
So, I mean, even my own mother, they pointed out that, this was the Indian Agency, they pointed out that they would pay for her nursing school, but she would have to put distance between her mother and father and herself.
They carried it down to the next generation.
Yes. And so, and she did. She got onto me. She and my dad, you know, my dad told me, he said, it's not right. He said, you've made a choice on how you want to live your life, but you're denying my grandchildren an opportunity for education and for betterment. He said, and for what? He said, beadwork isn't going to make a living for you. There's no insurance. There's no life insurance. There's no value in it. And I remember when I was selected to be a National Heritage Fellow, I was welcomed to Washington, D.C., and I was introduced to the world as a living American treasure. And I thought, Daddy?
You were wrong.
You know, but that was my mother.
Circle in a little bit, she's hard to understand. It's hard for her.
Yes, Barbara and I don't bite.
Yeah.
No, I anticipated we might have more people than we ended up having, so it's better to have a closed system.
Well, going back to Stephen Mopope and the beginnings of his artwork, from what I've read, he started drawing in sand, and then people noticed that he was very good, and so while he was in school, in the St. Patrick's Mission School, he was encouraged by Sister Olivia.
Sister Olivia, and the Mother Superior was a lady, help me, Carl. What's her name?
Good.
The Mother Superior that came from Philadelphia. Come sit over here.
Yeah.
Come on in. Come on in. She was she came from a very wealthy family, and she was the one that supervised she single-handedly made sure that St. Patrick's had money for the Indian Mission. And
Catherine Drexel.
thank you.
Catherine what?
Drexel. From the
was
Drexel
instrumental
Furniture.
In a lot of Indian schools and in a lot of black schools in the South.
And
Part of the Drexel.
with her influence, but also with Susie Peters and Sister Olivia, they were able to strong-arm Oscar Jacobson, who was the head of the art department. His wife was French. And so because the sisters, they came from France, and I believe Sister Olivia was Choctaw, and she joined the convent, and but it was through their efforts that they were able to secure a special program at the OU Art Department in Norman, Oklahoma.
And in doing that, Susie Peters she went against the U.S. policy, because their policy was not to encourage native style art, music, dance.
Which didn't change until the early 1930s. with a government edict, whatever,
Mhm.
to give American Indian citizenship and full rights.
Yeah, I think that was called the Indian New Deal, wasn't it?
Yes.
Was it John Collier at the bureau?
Yeah,
Yes.
John Collier. But at that point, Susie advocated for this
Yes.
group, Stephen and the 5 others, and they were able to go to the University of Oklahoma in a non-degree granting program and study. I'm not sure how much he instructed them or how much they just did their
No,
own thing.
they did their own artwork, and that was the whole point, was that he wasn't trying to change their artwork. He was wanting to encourage them with their traditional artwork.
Yes.
They were also encouraged to take part in campus activities. My grandpa, he said, I always thought I could handle myself. He said, so I tried out for the boxing team. He said, and Jack Hokey was my corner man, and Jack Hokey stuttered. Anyway, and he said, I remember going to the center of the arena, and I remember touching the other man's glove. He said, and I don't remember anything after that. He said, I do remember the lights going overhead as they carried me down the hall. He said, and Jack wasn't worried about me. He was more worried about what my wife would do to him if I didn't recover. You know, but they were hilarious. Right. And yeah, but he was telling him, he said, wake up, wake up. He said, Jeanette's gonna kill me. Anyway, but they always went everywhere together.
That was the group.
Yes.
But your grandfather was the oldest.
Yes, he was the oldest.
He was born in 1898, and the others went up to 1907.
And he was married, and he had children. And my grandmother worked the farm. My grandmother, there were different men who would come in, and they would, she could tell them what to do, and but she wasn't above running the tractor. She wasn't above going out. I remember, even being as a child, I remember us sleeping on the back of a tow sack, and she was out in the fields picking cotton. And I remember I got sunburned, you know, laying back there in the back of that big long bag. But I mean, she was just really this incredibly hardworking woman. And she could speak, in addition to Kiowa, she could speak Comanche. She spoke some French. At home, the Comanche was a trade language. And Wichita was also a trade language. And you know, so I mean, she was, there's some people who have a talent for language, and my grandmother was one. But she was also everything, where we live, being a traditional person, the land is my land, the home is my home. If he chooses to leave, he leaves with just the clothes on his back. You know, I don't know many men who would have that confidence to stick around. You know, it is, that's the way it was with my grandparents. My grandmother, this was her money, and this was my grandpa's money. And
they were separate.
Yeah, separate but equal.
And you now live on your grandfather's allotment.
Yes, their Indian allotment.
The Indian allotment. But that's not where you grew up. You grew up in there with your grandparents.
I was a few days old when my grandmother came by train. She traveled across the southwest part of the United States and came to Arizona and got me and brought me back to Oklahoma. So I grew up in Oklahoma. But you know, I mean, just imagine a woman getting on a train at that time and traveling by herself, you know. There was nothing, my grandmother feared no one. You know, it was, and I've often joked, you know, my little sister was so much like my grandmother. Stevette was my baby sister, and in fact, you're going to meet her cradle board tomorrow. And
Cradleboard she made.
she was my grandma and grandpa's joy. She was my grandma and grandpa's pet. And I remember Steve got mad at my grandma for some reason, and I don't know if you remember that old movie, the TV series, I Dream of Jeannie.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and the little turned up shoes that were real popular back in the 60s. Well, my Aunt Bennett bought my grandmother a pair. And so my little sister is talking back, and she's saying, my grandpa's an Indian police. My grandpa has a badge, he's got a billy club and a gun. I'm going to tell him to arrest you. And
Saying this to her grandmother.
saying this to my grandmother. And my grandmother says, oh yeah, she said, I'm going to kick you and your grandpa in the nose. And so she went and did her foot like this, and the shoe flew off of her foot, hit my little sister right in the right on the end of her nose, and my sister went down like she was shot. And my grandma picked her up. I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. And my sister is just, I'm going to tell on you. I'm going to make sure he arrests you this time. You know, but they were just, I think about them, and you know, I just had such good memories of them. They were just.
Sounds like they had a lot of fun together.
Oh, they did. They were absolutely wonderful. And my grandmother always made sure that we knew, you know, who we came from, how we were related, and that's something that is sadly lacking in today's Kiowa. You know, nobody talks about how we're related, and all Kiowas, you know, you can't get away from the fact we're all related, and so it is. You're tied to this history. His Stephen Mopope's going through his notes. I have a thank you note from President John F. Kennedy and from President Dwight D. Eisenhower, thanking him for his artwork and how beautiful it is. And my grandfather, he kept everything. And, you know, I was asking some other family members, do you have any photographs? No. Do you have any of their sketches? Do you have any of their paintings? No. So at that point, I shut up because I'm not going to tell them what I had.
Talking about being related to everyone, when Vanessa was working with me on the Kiowa Cradle exhibit, we tried to do this genealogy of all the cradle makers, and we found everybody got around a big table, and I gave them genealogy charts, and everybody was trying to figure it out, and pretty soon they were all kind of coming up with the same ancestors, and finding that there were these great relationships among families in those people who made cradles, and also that would hold true with the men and the artwork there, the cousins and daughters-in-law and so forth. So, and then coming back to a few people way back in the great days. So the fact that people like Vanessa have kept this knowledge alive is wonderful, and there are a few others, but you know, they're dying off, the people that really knew this, like the Rowell family. They knew who their ancestors were, and Sharon and Tani, they know. But interest in it is something you have to kind of write it down and pass it on so people can remember, because in those days everyone lived close to each other. And when and you probably saw most of your relatives every day or every couple of days. How far is where you grew up and where Stephen Mopope was as a boy, how far from Norman, Oklahoma, where the university is?
It's about, what do you think?
About 50 miles. And so, and in those days when they were traveling, the road in from Fort Cobb and so
It was
forth
a
to the
dirt
main
road.
road was
That was a dirt road.
a dirt road, yeah. So it was a big, it was a it was quite a ways to go, and to go that far away from home would have been something to ask. Now, tell them about that Lois Smokey, the one woman, and how she fared. The one woman in the Kiowa Five.
She was.
Here she is as a baby.
She was. Her family. They were premier beadworkers. They were one of the most important cradle board makers. She eventually left the group, and she was married. She had one of the largest Catholic weddings, and she didn't draw or paint anymore, but instead her focus was on beadwork, and so she was just. If you wanted an important quality piece, you know, she's one of the people that you would go to. And but out of her family, if Barbara hadn't recorded this exhibit, all of this information would have been lost. In fact, we were joking. In this group, I was the only living artist. Everybody else was dead, you know. So this brought together the known Kiowa cradle board makers with the cradle boards, and collectors found out how valuable they were, and so the pieces. They would quite often end up in a museum in some faraway, distant state, and it was identified as a cradle board, tribe unknown. They didn't even recognize that it was a Kiowa board. And so Barbara was able to bring together the Kiowa and the Comanche people, and sadly though, at home, Barbara tried to get the Kiowa Apaches, who were also really elite beadworkers. They had this exquisite cradle board that was at the Philomathic Museum, but she couldn't even get anyone to return a phone call to her.
Yeah.
So they ended up being left out of the exhibit.
And that cradle had a name written into it.
Yes, in script.
Yeah, in script, beaded into it.
On the side.
Yeah. Well, we can't give away all tomorrow's secrets.
Well, I have to tell you that I don't have any degrees. You know, I suppose if I had a degree, it would be gossip. You know, that's, you know. But, you know, we want to, if you want, one of the most important things that we had to learn when we were children was to be quiet. You couldn't talk. And then whenever the elders, they'll let you know when they're finished talking. And then at that point, you know, you can ask a question. You know, but I remember my own little sister, she had this incredible gift. She could sing. I sound like a cat when you step on its tail. That's the quality of my singing. You know, I don't sing, you know, only in the safety of the darkness when I would sing to my little grandson, you know, but it's that kind of talent comes from, you have to be around people who are active singers. And my grandmother, you know, she composed songs. She made songs for Gus Palmer. She made a song for Dixon Palmer and their brother Lindrith. Lindrith was killed during World War II. You know, so I mean, women were incredibly important in our culture. And so with my grandfather, it was his own mother who was his biggest supporter.
And that was King Tuttle?
Paukeigope.
Paukeigope, yes. The grandmother was King Tuttle. Yeah. Well, after they went to to school at University of Oklahoma, Oscar Jacobson arranged for them to have an international tour, and that's really what put them on the map as far as the world recognizing this kind of traditional Kiowa art, which sometimes they called, they called it sometimes easel art because they did a lot of mural paintings. And, but it then spread. There was a portfolio of Kiowa drawings, which we have at the Hafenreffer Museum, which are the prints, the serigraphs actually, not the original drawings that you have. But it was widely circulated, and that really people became aware of this group, and they became part of the history of Plains Native art, from working on hides, working on teepees and calendars, and
Shields.
And Stephen Mopope learned that kind of art from two of his great uncles, Silverhorn Haungua and Owataunt. And that in turn sort of went back to the ledger art from the Fort Marion School in Florida, when prisoners drew on paper, and that ledger art has blossomed today and become very valuable. And it's narrative art telling stories of daily life.
We have one example in the military collection by a man by the name of Chief Killer, and I don't remember what tribe he was, what people he was from. But it's available in the Brown Digital Repositories, so it can be viewed on that.
Yes, it's a whole book, isn't it? The
It's a
ledger
whole
book,
ledger,
not just
yeah, it's
one
the whole
drawing.
ledger. Yeah,
Mhm.
the whole ledger.
Yeah. And but so with Stephen Mopope learning from ledger art to then this hide working that his great uncles did, and one of his great uncles was also one of the Fort Marion prisoners, so he brought that tradition, and then getting the more formal exposure at the university, and then the European exposure, so that by the time they came back in 1929, which is about the time these were done, Stephen Mopope was well known, and spent some time at the Santa Fe School of Indian Arts under Dorothy Dunn, who then created another kind of way of looking at Native art. So it's been a long tradition, but the Kiowa 5 or the Kiowa 6, I always like to include the woman, even though she didn't stay long, had really put that Southern Plains art on the map for people, and that's why it's really so important.
Didn't Stephen also get invited to do a mural at the Bureau of the Interior in Washington?
Yes.
Okay, so that you can see, I think in the Bureau of Interior has a video tour of their murals, and this is one of the ones that you see.
We have a sketch he did of before he did that, and that's something that needs to be conserved.
I would think.
Is this a pencil sketch?
Yes.
Pencil sketch of the mural in the interior.
Really?
One of them. There's two. I think.
You'd have heart failure if you came
Yes,
to
I
our
would.
house.
I'm not ready. I'm like, what is it on? How is it being stored?
It's on top, really.
Exactly.
And it got wet.
Yeah.
He did sketches on, just all of a sudden, he'd say, quick, hand me a piece of paper. So there's like a Levine's department store, the little,
Tissue paper.
yeah,
the
that
wrapper.
tissue that was in there. There's a drawing on the back of that.
And envelopes and.
Have you digitized any of this?
No, it's everything. Like I said, you'd have heart failure if you saw my stuff.
We did good to get them Xerox.
Yeah, right.
And you're still storing them at home.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Ooh,
That's all we'll
grant.
say
Did they
about
go
that.
Let's write a grant.
Write a grant, yes.
Let's write a grant.
That's what needs to be done. And did they go into the tornado shelter with you
Yes, they do.
when those things happen?
We were telling her, we've got all kinds of tornado stories. So that our daughter, that's the first thing that she carried down into the cellar Then the next was Mom and Daddy, but it went after Grandpa's. It went after Grandpa's
Good.
sketches.
So you have her well trained then.
Yeah. So, but we were telling Barbara last night at dinner that our daughter had ordered us into the shelter, and we're all standing in there belly button to belly button because, you know, we've got all this stuff in there, and then the phone rings. And she said, "All right, who's got the damn phone?" And she had picked up the telephone, and so she's holding it in her hand, and it's ringing, and but she had carried, in the excitement, I suppose in her haste, you know, she's carried
Carry the phone in.
carried the phone down into the cellar.
It was somebody interested in how we were. We were asking, "How are you?" I said, "We don't know. We're in the cellar." He said, "You tell us."
What's left up there?
Morgan telling us what the weather's like up above us.
Now we've been. I wondered how my grandpa and grandma, they had a cellar, and my grandmother traded a pair of moccasins for a cellar, and she had these big dishes, this enamelware, and it had fruit on it, and she took good care of that, you know, and they were teasing, Jack Hokie and Grandpa were teasing my grandmother and saying, "Your name should be Prairie Dog. You see one little cloud and you run into the cellar." Anyway, but she's down in the cellar, and we're hanging on to there are knots in the rope, and then it goes through these series of loops, and so guess who's on the first knot? Me. So if I'm blown out the door of the cellar, Stevette's not in any danger of being lost. You know, she's back there in the safety. But I'm on the first knot, and my cousin is on the second knot, and Stevette's on the third knot in the very back. But I remember the rain is coming down. It's not coming down like this. It's coming down sideways. And Grandpa Steve and Jack Hokie now have made the decision it must be time for us to go into the cellar. They can't stand up. The wind is blowing so hard. But they've got my grandma's enamelware, these large bowls on their head, trying to protect themselves from the hail and the rain. And you know, my she said, "Don't let them in, hold on to that rope." Anyway, but they had to crawl back to the front porch. Anyway, she was mad at them because they had big dents in the...
They exposed the enamelware.
Yeah, they ruined her enamelware. She was mad at them for that.
And now a family of buzzards have taken up
Yeah,
residence in the summertime in the cellar, and they raise the chickens.
That's our claim to fame. We raise buzzards.
So,
Yeah.
well, does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask Vanessa?
Now you look like you have a question.
Other than the history of you doing beadwork and artwork, for me being a bead artist, it's a little bit difficult getting in the art world and being recognized as beadwork being art. It's more of a craft in the eyes of contemporary work, where if it's in museums, it's considered art by artists that are not living anymore. So did you have that difficulty
No.
with your art?
I never thought of myself as an artist. To me, an artist was a sculptor, or like my grandfather, a painter. That, to me, is what an artist was. You know, I just came just on my sheer knowledge of gossip, you know, and I ran into people like Barbara, who just happened to be looking for an odd little duck like me. And
I had to follow you up after that gourd dance celebration up to your home.
oh, yes.
People said, "You must talk to Vanessa."
I know, they were
She's the
saying, "Are
one."
you sure?"
Yeah.
Boy, she's scary.
She had to bring her uncle to tell her, to tell us go ahead and tell her what she wants to know. Jacob.
Yes,
Yeah.
that was the
Who said that?
precursor. That was one of my uncles.
Oh.
They told me that, you know,
Oh.
I sent her, so you have to answer all of her questions.
Yeah.
You know, so
Jacob, yeah, Jacob Atom.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's so wonderful that there was, you know, that Vanessa is a living bead artist, a living tradition there. She stands alone. And
We have a question over here.
yeah,
I'm sorry, I should be
Okay.
more visible. How did the representatives from the New Deal come to your grandfather and encourage them to, him and the other painters, to go to the University of Oklahoma?
it was Susie Peters.
Yes.
She was the field matron, so
was
she
the-
really was she knew everyone.
Yeah.
And she got the idea that they should, and she then went to the university and talked to Oscar Jacobson, who was the head of the art department, and convinced him to take in these 6 young Kiowas and make a special program for them. And they all met at Jacobson House, and it wasn't a very big place,
No,
just sort of a little house.
Yes.
But that was a place where it could be
And they
theirs.
lived in an unfinished basement underneath the house. And she also, she knew different oil men, like Mr. Philbrook, who it never dawned on me that that was a real, honest-to-goodness, living human being.
You just thought it was a museum.
Yeah. You know, but he and several other oil men, they guaranteed a stipend for them, you know, to take care of their rent and their food.
That's good. I didn't know that.
Yes.
I was wondering.
See, old gossip.
Yeah, I didn't know that's how they did it. And then Lois Smokey, her mother moved up there with her and rented a house because she was, what, 17 or
Yes,
something?
she
and
was single and
single
young.
woman, couldn't live with these 5 men. But all along she felt that they didn't respect her work. And as it turns out now, everybody looks for Lois Smokey work because there isn't very much of it.
Even her grandchildren, they have none of her artwork at
Yeah,
all,
there isn't.
including her beadwork.
There isn't very much of it, apparently, of the, at least, you know, the painted art. But I had read recently that it's become much sought after. No, I think it was a combination, to answer your question, of
I'm sorry,
basically it was Susie Peters and Olivia, the sister Olivia, who could see the promise and knew they had to get them out of this small community where nobody would ever see their work. And so they made this big push to get them up to the university, and from there to Europe, and then back to the studio in Santa Fe. So that some of the work is, he has an Apache, he has a Zuni one. It shows that he moved around.
And there's another element that you need to be aware of. You couldn't leave the reservation without written permission from the superintendent. And so we have letters. You know, these, Steve and these boys are good boys. Any assistance you could give them, I would greatly appreciate. If you have any problems, please contact me. You know, so I mean, if you can imagine how dehumanizing that was for my grandfather.
That was from the agent at the time.
That was what,
From the
from
agent.
the agent.
Agency.
I have a question for you. You had talked about the important role that your grandmother played for you, that you learned from her. And also, when Barbara was talking about Lois Smokey and how difficult it was for her to be part of this group, that she felt like they didn't respect her. So it made me wonder if perhaps there are different traditions in art making. Is there a male tradition and a female tradition?
There is.
Is painting
And
sort of one thing?
the Kiowa world, it's very specific. You know, there is like this unwritten rule a man can't go past this. You know, in the same way a woman, she can't go past this line. You know, so I mean, it's a very divided world. You know, for instance, the women can go to war now, but a woman can never become a member of the Kiowa Black Leggings Warrior Society, because that is only for Kiowa men.
The Kiowa Veterans Society, so even though she's a veteran.
Yeah, she could never be a member.
Might that ever change?
No.
No, that'll never change. You know, so I'm happy in my world. You know, it's here on the outside. I cannot figure out how you can function. You know, that airport alone at, where was it? Charleston. That scared the hell out of me. You know, I was riding in a wheelchair that I felt like, you know, I felt like I was going to tip over at any point. And even though this man was, you know, hollering for attention, you know, nobody was paying attention to him. And I really thought I was going to end up with somebody on my lap. You know, but it was just, I don't know how anybody can function in this fast-moving, to me it's a fast-moving society. You function in a world where credit cards are accepted. I don't own a credit card. You know, for Leah to trust that I can make it from the shuttle here and back to the hotel, boy, she's got all the confidence in the world in me. You know, I can't see how I'm going to get back and forth on the shuttle, you know, but I mean, these are things that it was baffling to me how my grandfather was able to go and do all of these different things in a time where he really and truly wasn't even considered a human being. You know, where we live, young people today, you cannot tell them that there is such a thing as the KKK. For my grandfather's time, when Jim Waldo, when they came back to the reservation from Carlisle, the KKK were there and they told him that they had their eye on him. It was the same thing with my grandfather. When he was going to school at OU, when he came back, there was a sign painted on the side of his barn that said, "The KKK has their eye on you."
They had the government send them to school. The government sent them to school, spent money on them. They were expected not to go back.
Go back to what they call go back to the blanket. You know, so I mean, this was lynching was a very real problem. In fact, today in Anadarko, Oklahoma, we lead the state of Oklahoma in unsolved murders. You know, there are lynchings, and they're passed off as suicide. You know, and they found the Indian male with his ankles tied and his hands are tied behind his back. How do you commit suicide like that? You know, but I mean, that happens there. And to tell my 19-year-old grandson, you be very careful, you know, because once you leave the safety of our home, what's going to happen to you? You know, I mean, and this child, you know, he's at 19, you're bulletproof. You know, and so, you know, he's grown up with stories about Stephen Mopope. I want to be like him. I want to go to art school. And so, you know, he's applying for the art school in Santa Fe. And, you know, it's just, how do you, I understand my parents' fear, you know, because like she was saying, it's very, how do you gain acceptance? I've never figured that out. I just do what I like to do, and I just
comes to you because you do it so well.
I've been fortunate. Had she not come, I guarantee I would have been back in that little community unknown. You know, and in Anadarko there is a co-op. And I always thought if I could join that co-op, I felt like I would gain recognition. But that was closed even to me. They said, what makes you think there would be an opening for you? You know, I mean, she just very cold-bloodedly told me that I would never be a member. So,
They sell things at the co-op that are keychains and
yes,
hair barrettes and not
just the tourist items,
Not
cradle
the,
board.
not
big
for the
things,
cradle
the big
board.
things.
Yeah.
Holly, in answer also to your question, yes, the division, you know, beadwork traditionally was a woman's art, and the narrative painting traditionally was a male art. So that's you know, why Lois, she was getting into that male art thing.
Yeah, so then that was why she was uncomfortable.
Yes.
Yeah.
And now in the 1970s, there have been a group of women who started to do ledger art, and they've gotten a lot of sort of kickback from people who didn't think they should be doing it, but they've persisted, and this is, you know, this is now, so they've been successful in doing the ledger art, but that was not women's thing to do. Women didn't tell the history of the tribe before. And of course, well, I'm going to say that for tomorrow. Oh, your other cradle. But, yeah.
Do you know if there was a gallery that represented them at the time? It sounds like they went after they came back from their European tour. It sounds like that was probably subsidized as well. Was there?
They did. They went to various galleries, yes, and there was one in New York. I remember reading this, but I don't have it just at my.
The other thing was my grandfather, his uncle was educated at Carlisle, Jim Waldo, and so when he came back, he became an ally of Quanah Parker, who was the big powerhouse
Among the Comanches.
among the Comanches, and they controlled who would receive the right-of-ways for the trains. And so there was a line called the MKT, Missouri, Kansas, and Texas. And so Grandpa would travel up and down this rail line service and with the dance group, and he would sell his paintings.
Okay.
He was very businesslike about it.
And almost all of his correspondence that we have is to someone or word back from someone trying to sell a painting
That's
to
fascinating.
an individual.
And he did a big mural also in the Anadarko post office,
Yes.
which is
And he was paid for one painting, but he did
15.
15 or 16, but
yeah,
it was
it's,
for
it's
one.
a huge mural. I mean, it goes like from here down to the wall. Great, and you.
On all four sides.
Yeah, one of the.
That
reasons-
used to be the Indian Agency.
Okay.
And so at night, he found out it was best to do the painting at night, because during the day, you know, elders, whoever, if the men got there first, you know, then the men, you know, they would all sit there. But if the women got there first, then the women would sit and they would critique him. Well, you know, Chief so-and-so would never allow a woman to set up tanning hides that close to the camp because it stinks. You know, and so he just figured out it was better, he'd get more work done at night.
He couldn't
So-
say the wall ends here.
And in fact, we have there are these brass, well, kind of like your glass floor out here. There wasn't air conditioning, you know, during the early part of the time that the Indian Agency was there, and so they had to allow for the circulation of the air anyway. But he had this idea for it was a moving camp scene anyway. But the idea was Kiowas. You always had animals, so dogs were just a natural part of the family anyway. And so in this one, in the original sketch, there's a dog leading this family. He's walking out ahead of this family, but this brass air circulation thing, this little screen, it blocks off where the dog would have been. So the sketch that we have, the dog was eliminated, yes.
To go. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to listen. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
I wish I could stay, but I have to get back to work.
Okay.
Have a good afternoon. Thank you again.
Does anybody else have a question?
I have another question, and I hope you won't mind. When we were looking at the paintings before, you were pointing out that these were particular people, if I understood you correctly. And I think because of the way that they were titled, I sort of thought maybe they were generic people. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about...
Oh, the one on the end, that's Apache Ben.
Right.
He was one of the wealthiest Kiowa Apaches. And in fact...
so he lived in Oklahoma.
He lived...
Your grandfather knew him there.
Yes, yes.
Now, there's a group of Apaches in Oklahoma that are Plains Apaches. Geronimo and their group came later on
From Arizona.
as members of the Fort Marion prisoners. And so that we have the Plains Apaches, which are now called the Kiowa tribe, or the Apache tribe of Oklahoma, and the Geronimo's Apaches called the Fort Sill Apaches. And the one he painted was used to be the Kiowa Apaches, and they were always known as for their association with the Kiowas, and they've recently gotten their own land.
Well, Apache Ben, because he was so wealthy, you know, there was some court, somebody was being tried, and he rented an entire floor of this hotel so that, you know, his friends and family would have a place to stay while they're going for this trial. Yeah. So I mean, he was a very real person, and that looks exactly like his photograph.
Oh, fantastic.
So, and see, that comes from being around old people too. You know, they had all these old photographs, and there again, you'd have heart failure if you saw how my photographs were all stored before Carl came. Carl organized them and donated them to the Oklahoma Historical Society, which I didn't know you could do. I was just carrying them around in these little
We donated
paper sacks.
The negatives for several, and they were kind enough to print them for us, so we have.
Oh, terrific.
Yeah, I would never have had the money to have been able to pay for the.
And that's a great repository, and they take very good care
Yes.
of things, and they're open to Native people and non-Native people to come in and look at all their. It's a great source of information.
Yeah, that's great. And another painting you were talking about with Barbara as you were looking at them was the flute dancer. And you were discussing whether he was in long underwear or painted. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more.
Well, they had, they used to wear, they called them long handles.
They dye them.
Yeah, they would dye them. I know he had at the end of his life, he had it was a pink shirt and yellow long handles, which my grandma had to dye for him, you know, because he couldn't. It was funny. They had this this relationship where they were separate but equal. But you know, my grandfather would draw. If she couldn't think of a design, you know, he would sketch a design for her, and then she would use it. And beadworkers are like painters. They're you own a design from now until the end of eternity, and you can't use a design without the permission of that original owner. And Kiowas are very territorial.
A lot of beadworkers have samples of their designs. We have a felt piece of felt that has her designs on it. And she had an old woman who called her and asked her to come get my designs. My children aren't interested, and she didn't do it, and she regrets it now.
I know, when they ask you to do something, you're not supposed to turn them
I'm
down.
supposed to say no, yeah. Well, that painting does have that blue long underwear. We're used to that today. Everybody wears, tights, and even though they're not allowed on the airplane, apparently. But that's what was very frequently worn. So whoever made the notation on the drawings called it blue paint.
Yeah, but they're tights.
Yeah, they're tights.
Interesting, okay.
And the individualism question, there's one, the sun, prayer to the sun, and it's definitely an older, more heavy-set man, indicating, this is a man of more import, or who would have been able to have this position to make the prayer. And it's not a thin young man like the dancers.
Yeah. Well, there's one man, his name was Whitehorse. He was at Fort Marion, and they're making fun of him. And he's responding to them in Kiowa, and he's saying, you say I'm fat, but he said, how many wives have I made cry because I've taken their husband and they killed him in an act of war. Anyway, so I mean, it's a very powerful expression, but at that time they painted, and even black leggings, which Barbara has come. The men, they would paint their body yellow, and their arms, they would be painted black to the elbow, and then their legs are painted black to the knee, and then they have these big black circles, and it represents that time when he's saying, he said, when I'm lost and I'm out there on the prairie, that it's the carrion the birds that are going to be feasting on me. And so that's what those black circles, that's what that represents. So I mean, painting was...
I'm a warrior and I'm not afraid to die.
I'm not afraid to die.
Get ravaged.
They may eat me, the birds and stuff may eat me, but I'm not afraid.
Which brings up, we were a warrior culture. And so like the grandson of the original White Horse, his name was Roland. And he was this was a war deed anyway, but he was a scout, and his operator, he had this crank phone that they would wind up and they would report the enemy positions anyway, but they were pinned down in this field, and so they spent, I think, like 13 hours, and they're trying to decide, is this a turnip field or is this a beet field? But they're just trying to occupy their minds, because out here there's a German sniper that's trying to kill them, and so, but he's saying, he said, under those stars, he said, my family, he said, they're at home, they're safe. He said, that's why I'm here, which is very appropriate, for a Kiowa warrior. So, I mean, it's...
brought home, especially when we went to France during Halley's Comet. And in Oklahoma, we see Halley's Comet in the sky. And in France, we saw the same thing.
Surely you have a question of some sort. Just grin at me.
No, it's wonderful listening to you talk and tell stories.
The fact that there's two paintings there, one a man with a flute, the other the man dancing with the flute. How did that go, the dancing with the flute?
Well, the flute, in Oklahoma, there were two positions, and they carried the flute. And it was a actually it was in the beginning, it was an eagle bone whistle, which they would have used also for the Sundance.
Sundance, yeah.
But then they were replaced by a metal flute or like a bamboo flute. Anyway, but they would blow on it. And then when they would blow on it, they're telling the drum, they're instructing the drum, you know, sing that song longer. And so, you know.
His artistic license, he probably painted the flute rather than the whistle. But because he was a flute player.
Yeah, I see. So that's, is that the one that's dancing with it or the one that's just?
Dancing.
Yeah, dancing.
Okay.
And I noticed on the single figure with the flute, there's not a plug at the end of the flute to, you know, direct the air.
Stop.
He's left that out.
I still have his flute.
Oh.
And it has a, there was a gray fox. So it has this real beautiful long nose. Anyway, but, you know, but I mean, even his flute was beautiful. But he played the flute until before he passed away. And our oldest son, you know, he loved playing the flute.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's so haunting. And the other, that final one that we talked about before, this, the sword swallower or arrow swallower.
I think I probably got that wrong. I probably think it says arrow swallower.
It does. It says arrow swallower, but the society among the Zuni is actually sword swallowers, and the purpose of it was to bring snow and rain for the crops, to bring that kind of weather for the crops. So they didn't ever practice it in, I guess, when it was too cold. But it was a group that learned how to swallow what were actually curved juniper sticks, and they would grease them and paint them with red ochre. And then there was a medicine given to the initiates. They were all closed into the place where they were practicing, and they took this medicine for several days. And the thought is that it was something that relaxed their throat muscles, sort of enlarged the throat, so that by relaxation.
They were piercing it as they were.
Yeah. And then they would go out, and men and women took part, and the men, sometimes they would do two at once, down, insert it down your throat and then out, back again. And so the fact that he painted that in 1929, and this was recorded by an anthropologist, the whole ceremony, in 1930, so he actually saw this happening. You know, he's not painting from memory.
Right.
So I think that's
That's what's really a revelation about, you know, looking at these paintings with you, is that I've learned more about the context.
There's another side note. When there was a very wealthy white woman who married a Taos man, and he would write to my grandfather, and he would tell him, you know, my wife is wanting to have a tea party. Can you bring a couple of your better looking dancers and, you know, and sell, you know, you can sell your paintings. And, you know, but that was really something that I was surprised about. And I still have one of the paintings. The last name was Lujan, Lujan.
Yep.
But
Would it have been out of the ordinary that, I mean, he's capturing other tribes, right?
No.
no, it wouldn't have been.
This is all?
Mhm.
This was all within his,
We have pictures of him painting Caddos, Wichita's, and these other tribes. We have many sketches of other tribal peoples being,
We
but
even,
would he have been accepted into,
well, into their families, and then from there into the tribe.
they had he did everything. He even proposed the these cutouts. There's like of a real skinny prisoner, and he's got this little black and white striped hat. Yeah.
To be photographed, you.
Yeah, then there's
Yes, okay.
there's another photograph, and it's like a big sunflower. You can stick your face,
Right.
and they can take your picture, and it's like "Welcome to the Sunshine State."
Right.
Anyway, but yeah, he had. He wasn't. He had this.
Together and then.
Yeah, he was. If you met him, he was the most down-to-earth man. He had this really funny sense of humor. He never made fun of anyone. Never. He would make fun of himself. And, you know, but he was, my grandmother would get mad at him, you know, because by the time my grandmother's gone into the grocery store and come back and set her groceries on the back seat, my grandpa hasn't even made it into the front of the grocery store yet. You know, but my grandma said, "You act like you're running for office." You know, but he was just this wonderful man. He could talk to anybody. And I remember there was this one really fancy lady who came. She had a driver, and for some reason, my grandmother had a billy goat, and this driver had opened the door, and he helped this lady into the house, and the billy goat has climbed into the car, and he's eating the back seat. Anyway, and my grandmother just wanted to kill that billy goat, you know, because I mean, obviously it's infringing on my grandfather's chance to sell the painting,
Right.
you know.
Right.
So yeah, so.
Do you mind if I read what those words your mother wrote about her father?
Oh no, please
Okay.
do.
If I can get over there with this thing. This is Vanessa's mother, and
I never heard her talk Kiowa. She was a nurse, and when she retired, she just stayed home. And I never heard her talk Kiowa until when she was dying. And she only talked Kiowa. They had to get her uncle to come talk.
Translate.
to her.
Go ahead.
she said, I've seen sketches of the procession. This is a particular artwork, but I've never seen it completed. Well, the sketches were in my grandmother's back room. It had windows all around. It was real bright in the studio back there. That's where my dad painted. He'd just sit down and kind of shake his pencil every now and then he'd start drawing. But he'd never say, I'm going to draw this and I'm going to draw that. When he got through eating, he'd just say, well, I'm going to get back to work, and he'd start working. He always liked to translate what's happening with his people. He said he was proud to see his people doing so well for themselves, trying to keep it like it was. He said, it just does something to you in here. It makes you feel good. Now, I think a thought that was passed down to Vanessa. Makes you feel good to keep the old ways going. Anyway, I think there was one other quote from her in here, not sure. Oh no, this was somebody else. The nice thing about this book was that they, Visions and Voices, was that they tried to find the descendants of the artists and had them say a little something, which is quite unusual. And
Very nice.
yeah.
We were talking about the transportation system when he was a special student at OU. Because my grandfather was older, because he did so well at selling his paintings, he had a Model T Ford. And he and Jack Hockey and this Kiowa man by the name Crooked Neck Charlie went to Pryor, Montana, and they had gone up there for a peyote meeting, and
To bring peyote to the crows.
they had never, this was the first time that they had to have a peyote meeting to be held up there. And so last night we were talking at dinner, and but the end of this story was that the famous Crow chief, Plentycoos, came to the house and ordered them to stop that peyote meeting. They said, "It's not Crow. Throw that gourd, throw that staff, throw that drum into the water." He said, "It's not Crow."
I've never heard that story. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Because Plentycoos was the one that taught the Crow to accommodate to the white culture. He had this dream that all the buffalo were going to disappear into a hole in the ground, and out of that ground came a bunch of animals that looked like buffalo, except they were white with brown spots, or brown
Sounds like
with
he
white
had some
spots or
Longhorn.
something. In other words,
Longhorn.
it was the
Longhorn.
cattle. And so after that, he said he saw that the white man was going to win, and so he always advised the Crows to accommodate, and they did. So this would be, I can understand then why he would be wanting them to stay in a Christian atmosphere, Christian church, and not do the peyote. That's very interesting. I didn't know he had done that.
Well, that
Which is interesting today because our son is married to a Crow. And she's a Pentecostal and he sun dances.
oh
Yes.
boy, the battles! You should see the battles that go on there.
That would be so.
I know. She said she took him to church, and he said, "Mama," he said, I went sideways. He said, "I even tried to go in backward." He said, "My foot just would not go over that threshold." And he said, "So I told her, the day that you follow me into the Sundance, I will follow you into your church." And he said, it hasn't happened yet. So, yeah, but that was something that I was always surprised at, because the road system, it probably didn't even exist then, but somehow they made it up there with Jack Hokie, and there were Tennyson, Barry, so there were like
They all went
6 or 7 men in this one Model T.
That would be something that Arthur Amiot should have painted.
In the journey of your grandfather being an artist, did he ever venture into using other materials other than what he's known for, like oil on canvas or watercolors?
Stephen Mopope.
Well, these are opaque watercolors, the gouache.
And
Yes,
we have
what did-
some, I think they were classroom projects that are painted on a
Oh,
real soft, like a board for the wall. And they're.
it was to teach perspective. So there was like a lighthouse at the end of this long waterway. But I always wondered, where on earth did he see a lighthouse?
Well, he went to Europe,
He
didn't
may
he?
have been copying paintings.
But, you know, so, yes, I forgot that we had that.
Ever?
There again, we'd have heart failure. Don't come.
There's a picture-
I want to.
There's a picture of Taos Pueblo that is a exercise in Cubism. But you
Oh,
recognize it as
that's
the
right.
tower of the church at Taos.
So there wasn't really teaching them how to take apart their traditional work.
No.
It was, I guess, his own interpretation of that cube was Taos Pueblo.
Right. And then from that, I mean, Oscar Howe developed out of this tradition. So he started out in very realistic narrative way and gradually became more abstract. But he's based in this tradition. So it was definitely the way they felt comfortable expressing themselves for a period of around 30 years or so, 30 or 40 years.
The generation after Steve and Oscar Howe.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, even like there isn't a word for art in the Kiowa culture, but we're not, I mean, where you have walls that you can hang your paintings, we love beautiful things. And so the calendars that we did, you know, it recorded our history, but even the park bleach, you know, they were an early version of a suitcase, but it was a way to store things and to move things, you know. So, like for instance, his flute, you know, that's hand carved from cedar. So I mean, it's basically a tree branch. But how did he see, looking at that tree branch, that this would be perfect for a flute? You know, I don't see how he could do that, but he did it.
The artist's eye, finding forms. And of course, you have a lot of, it's pencil or charcoal drawings at home. What are they?
Pencil, they're ink pen. I think they're
colored pencil too?
Some of them.
Yeah.
I think the
We even have Crayola.
Crayola.
Uh-huh.
Cowboy Hall of Fame, there must have been at one point a contest or something to design license plates for cars, and he sent in several in red and green, or red and blue crayon.
Before Alan Hauser got his Oklahoma license plate, that, what is it, the Song to the Rain Gods, I think. What?
I'm not familiar with
Yeah.
it. I don't know it.
And the Christian, even in the 1990s when he submitted that, the Christians thought it was because of the way they presented it, a pagan thing, and they didn't like it.
Yeah, well, you're in the hotbed of the Christian people there too. So
I
it
know.
should be.
Well, our daughter just goes everywhere. You know, she's not afraid. And she said, you know, she said, I thought Oklahoma was the Bible Belt. She said she had gone to, I think she had gone to where the Airborne Rangers are. My niece's husband was stationed over there. Anyway, so she's summer's traveling over there. Anyway, and this preacher saw her car tag, Kiowa tag. Anyway, she said, here's this complete stranger. He came walking up to me, and he doesn't know me from anybody, and he's telling me that I'm a sinful creature. She said, I guess basically because I have a Kiowa tribal tag on the back of my car. Anyway, she said, I don't know how you can make that kind of a leap. Anyway, but, or as my son says, Mama, you are just a magnet for the weird.
Well, he did a lot of peyote painting too, and created abstract motifs that became well known of the, you know, the bird spirits, and there's several that he and one of the other, I forget, it was Monroe Sato.
Yes, Monroe.
That did really abstracted the peyote church paraphernalia in a most interesting way.
There was one peyote scene. You can just see the top. You can see a man's from his nose up. Anyway, but it was as if they're looking down on the inside of the church, inside of the teepee.
Oh yeah, it's the teepee side is pulled up and they're looking in, and yeah, there was one picture here somewhere that had the abstraction of that he was known for. I'm going to trip on this one of these days.
Don't let me
Oh,
trip
here.
you on my cane.
Talking about different tribes, the Kiowas were traditional enemies.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
The Navajo. And Steve Mopope has a painting, or not a painting, it's a painted drawing on a, I think it's on typing paper, or that size, of an X-rated scene.
Carl Jennings.
And he's taken the Navajo, there's a Navajo couple, and because they were they were enemies, they were liable for that kind of exploit.
Paul, you can edit that out.
He's not wired in anyway, so he probably didn't hear it.
You know, once I tried to kick him because I didn't approve of what he was saying, and he goes, "Ow!" He said, "Why are you kicking me? I want you to be quiet."
She kicked me too. That's the first time she ever drank schnapps.
Well, do you think should we move the camera over to look at the artwork?
It's something I can shoot later. I mean, no one here will be able to see what I'm shooting, so.
Okay.
Vanessa, I had a question for you. Is there a particular piece of your grandfather's that holds special meaning to you, or is your favorite, or that you would like to talk about?
He did a really quick, it seemed like it was a Crayola
No, the oil.
sketch of my grandmother,
Yeah.
the profile.
No, that's just a picture.
And then Carl did a sketch of me.
It's a pencil drawing of her grandma with a baby on her back. And I did a Crayola sketch, just with, 4 or 5 lines of Vanessa with our grandson.
So that's very special to me.
And she and a picture, photograph of her great grandmother with Steve on her back. So it's 3 generations of grandmothers with babies.